So I joined the think tank community about 5 years ago. I had just finished graduate school, and I was studying economics in a pretty theoretical department. So I had this new experience of having reporters call me, and I had to pick up the phone and answer whatever questions they threw my way, which was a fun and daunting exercise. One of the questions that I found that I was asked almost daily through that process was, is a student loan crisis on the horizon? As I just said, I had come out of graduate school at this point, so I was intimately familiar with the academic literature on the financial returns to investments in education. I was somewhat familiar with the headlines that were pervasive on the issue of student debt, but it wasn't as obvious to me why the media was really obsessed with this question about a student loan crisis. We were just a few years out from the mortgage crisis, and I believe a lot of people were drawing parallels between what could happen in student lending and what we had seen happen in mortgages. So using the economic lens that I had been given in my training, I was imagining higher education in the lens of it was an investment that pays off over the course of the lifetime. The estimates that we have from the academic literature suggest that if you think of education that way and aggregate across all the experiences that Americans have had over history, over the past decade, the financial returns to this investment has held steady at about 15%. Okay, so a 15% rate of return, and I knew full well that the federal government was making loans at subsidized interest rates to borrowers, which range, at least currently, from about 4 to 6%. So if you think of it in this way, think of it again in the lens of a long-run investment that pays off over the course of the lifetime. You've got students making an investment with a pretty decent margin, a large margin of return, at least for the typical borrower. So it seemed obvious to me at this point that there was a huge dissonance between the way that people were talking about student loan debt in the popular media, in the popular discussions of the issue in the policy world, and the evidence that we had to support that conversation. And so this really inspired me to embark on this agenda of research that was aimed at, one, reconciling this dissonance that I saw, but also just giving more descriptive evidence to what was happening in the student loan market more generally. So what does it look like? Just so for a bit of an overview. So the first thing, we know that more people are borrowing today than have ever borrowed in the past. So some of the most recent data tells us that among young households, 40% are currently holding some form of student loan debt. And that's up pretty drastically from about 2 decades earlier when just 14% of young households were carrying some student loan debt. We also know that people are borrowing more than they've ever borrowed before. So more people are borrowing, and each of them are borrowing more. So during that same period of time, over the past 20 years, the average debt has more than tripled for these same young households who are holding some level of student debt. And the statistic that we've all heard over and over and over is that those two things have amounted to an outstanding student debt burden for this nation of $1.3 trillion. Again, we've heard these statistics over and over, but the discussion generally stops there. So instead, I say, let's consider applying a different lens to this. If we think of investments in education as paying off over the course of a lifetime, we can think of these increases in debt, in fact, as a symptom of increased investment in education, which we know pays dividends both to the individual and to society. For instance, when we talk about the $1.3 trillion in student loan debt, we rarely talk about the increases or estimated increases in GDP that will result from the increased productivity from the investments in human capital that have taken place. So this is the right way to be thinking about investments in higher education and the right way to be thinking about what needs to be done, if anything, with our student lending situation. So what else do we know? In contrast to the general understanding, the very large outstanding student loan balances are in fact exceedingly rare. Only 7% of households have more than $50,000 in student loan debt, and just 2% of households have more than $100,000 in student loan debt. And in fact, the large balances are held by the folks who have very lucrative graduate and professional degrees and also have high incomes. Of course, there are individuals who do not have high earnings who have high incomes, but generally speaking, this is the trend that we observe in the data. Among bachelor's degree holders, less than $40,000 is the norm, and greater than $60,000 is largely unheard of for individuals who have just attained a bachelor's degree. So it's easy to understand why the media has focused on these very high balance borrowers in contrast to the more typical experiences that are far less newsworthy. I sometimes imagine what the headline would look like if instead the stories were accurately portraying what's happening, and I think it would look something like, student borrower gets well-paying job after college and faces affordable monthly payments.